The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap. On today's episode, the Trident Room podcast hosts Luke Goorsky and Marcus Antonellis sit down and have a conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Trident Room podcast. This is Luke Goorsky. I'm here with Marcus Antonellis, and we are continuing our shipbuilding series where a couple of us dumb JOs go and pontificate about what we think the Navy should be doing. To do a quick recap of our last episode, we kind of discussed what we want in a future ship, looking at what kind of things we would want when we're more advanced in rank, 0506 flag level. If we go to a war with a peer competitor, what kind of ships are we going to be sitting at that point saying, wow, I wish we had more of this? So last time we talked about how these ships need to be survivable. In other words, they need to be able to ensure that they're able to deliver whatever capabilities we need. And we kind of broke that down into three sections. First, we talked about how we needed to have assured C2, so the ability to communicate on and off the ship. The second piece we talked about was having a right-sized and right-trained crew to enable the operations. And the third piece was making sure that we have the right number of these ships so that they are in the places we need them to be in sufficient numbers. So today we're going to transition to talk about kind of the second piece of that. So we talked about how we need survivable capability. Today we're going to talk about what those capabilities we think we're going to need in the future. So to kick that off, we'll talk about the most fun part of the capability side of the spectrum, which is things that go boom, missiles and whatever else, rockets. I think we'll have a kind of interesting discussion here as we kind of start out with the kinetic capabilities that we think will be necessary for the U.S. Navy to have in a pure competitor environment in the 2030s, 2040s. So I guess to kind of kick this off, Marcus, you have a lot more experience with missiles and things like that than I do. So I think the number one thing, or at least right now, the Navy's primary offensive capabilities are delivered through their VLS systems. Did you say that's accurate?
Yeah, for sure. And the VLS system is good for a lot of reasons, right? It gives you some versatility there. You can there's all sorts of flavors of standard missiles you can put in there. You can put in a few the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. Again, more of a defensive application there, but worth a mention for this discussion. And then, of course, you have your Tomahawk. And I definitely think there's some cool stuff happening coming down the pipeline from the folks down in Port Hueneme as far as Tomahawk capabilities go. So I think that's an interesting option as well. But yeah, VLS is great. I mean, we've used it since the late 80s, and it's served its purpose pretty well as a part of the Aegis combat system.
Yeah, so I realize we're just talking about all these systems as two Navy guys, and not all our listeners are Navy people. So we'll just do a quick VLS, vertical launch system. So that is, you kind of see, if you look down the aerial view on a ship, you see a bunch of little gray cells on the front and back of the ship, and those contain missiles. And these are just long tubes. Marcus, how long would you say they are?
I mean, they're about 3 decks tall, so about 30, 35 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, there's the support equipment. So the whole unit itself is, I would say, about roughly 50 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
Back of the napkin guess. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah. So you just have, I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but on our cruisers, destroyers, approximately 100 of these cells, which can carry a variety of missiles. And that's kind of, I think, when we were talking before the podcast, one of the VLS system's real advantage is that you can put a variety of different missiles in them. So as Marcus, as you mentioned, Tomahawk at the beginning, which from my understanding is probably one of our largest missiles that we're putting in there. Is that accurate?
It's actually kind of deceiving. They actually had a pretty good, again, I'm going to do a plug for Port Hueneme. They have at their gate, they have a mock-up of SM-3. And then they have a closer in by the building. They have a Tomahawk, and the Tomahawk is, I would say definitely smaller, significantly smaller than a standard missile. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and that's for a number of reasons, right? You think of a Tomahawk, it's a slower moving cruise missile,
right?
So it gets kicked out of the VLS. It gets pointed in the right direction, and it just sort of goes along at its own pace. It's not a very fast missile. It's not a very agile fancy maneuvering missile, but it gets the job done. Whereas with the standard missile, it's quite fast because just different applications. The standard missile was designed for air defense, so countering very, very fast targets. Whereas the Tomahawk, again, different mission set. It has an evolving mission set, I would definitely say, but for the longest, it's just been a strike missile. So fixed target, not going anywhere. Fixed as far as, certainly hit a car or a moving vehicle, but not another missile moving on the order of Mach plus speeds.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I know that they've been, working on the Tomahawks and converting those into be anti-ship cruise missiles is a program that's ongoing. But traditionally, I think for most of our listeners, when you think of Tomahawks, it's getting launched out of ships in Operation Desert Storm or into Iraq or Syria or wherever to hit fixed targets over land. So provides that unique capability. The SMs, you talked about their standard missiles. Those are primary for air defense. However, we have used those in ship-to-ship roles or ship-to-ship tests, from my understanding. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, there have been several public tests now of SM as used as a surface weapon, not just an air-to-air target.
Mm-hmm. So then you can kind of go shorter range, faster missile, but with the flexibility of being able to hit air, land, sea targets. And then, like you mentioned, the Sea Sparrow, which is a little bit more of a, close-in, point defense isn't quite the right word, but...
it's a limited area. It doesn't have, without getting too much into the weeds, it's not a very extended. Mm-hmm. The E stands for evolved, not extended, and I'll leave it at that. But yeah, and then there's a few other non-VLS systems we have, right? There's Sea Sparrow comes in a traditional quad or 8-pack launcher. You see those on some of the carriers. Mm-hmm. And then you have the rolling airframe missile, the RAM. And that, again, a very good solid weapon system, but very limited range.
Right.
So, yeah, I would definitely say point defense, like as something's coming after you. You can't really protect your neighbor with a system like with those systems, just given their low range. What we see now with a lot of the blossoming technologies from some of our adversaries, the speeds are increasing, and that pushes or it depresses your reaction time. Mm-hmm. So these very short range missiles, a missile going Mach 5+, the hypersonic, will quickly travel 10 miles in not enough time to react. I don't want to do any public math here, but
yeah,
you don't have enough time.
Right.
Period. And while these are good defensive systems, they just have been designed to a different threat.
Right. So we'll revisit hypersonics in a minute because I think that's really valuable. But just kind of focus in on the VLS in terms of its current applications and where it might go, or weaknesses and advantages. So I think we identified the key advantage where it gives you a lot of flexibility, gives you a lot of different missiles. And I think when you read or when going through articles about envisioning the way warfare is now in the missile age or is going, and even how it's been since cannons and stuff like that, one of the key points is the number of missiles that you can provide on target. And so when you start looking at some of the modern naval tactics theories, things like that, it in some ways some people reduce it down to counting of VLS tubes. How many VLS cells, tubes do you have versus the enemy, so that you can put more missiles on than them. And I think one of the interesting discussions we have for that going forward is how valuable the VLS cells are and where they should be. Because, yes, we're counting VLS cells, but really what we care about in that is the missile or the offensive capability. So we talked about their advantages. What would you say is the biggest disadvantage of the VLS systems, Marcus?
Yeah, so it's a large system. They're getting it smaller and smaller. Like we mentioned earlier, there have been tests with just single VLS tubes that have been successfully employed on very small units. But yeah, it's on ships at least where you have 96 plus VLS cells. It becomes a very maintenance intensive system. There's a whole NEC dedicated to being a VLS technician.
So NAC meaning a job in the Navy. Someone's entire job is knowing how to fix the VLS tubes.
Exactly. So it's a very complex system. It requires all sorts of support, cooling, fire main for emergency deluge if you have an issue, a lot of electricity, a lot of power. So yeah, it's a very intense system, but it's a very robust system. Very high success rate. Pretty reliable system as well, because like I said, it's been around since late 80s. It's a very mature technology by now. And I definitely think, going into the future, I definitely think there will still be a vertical launch system. Will it be the one that's been on the Ticonderoga and Arleigh Burke class destroyer? I don't know, but I definitely feel that the versatility and the proven technology of a vertically launched system definitely has a place into the future. There'll obviously be improvements to be made. That's just the nature of technology. It will open faster. It will require less power. It will require less, or it'll cool more effectively. Those will all happen. But as far as generational leaps or revolutionary technologies when it comes to a missile delivery or a physical missile handling and launching system, I don't know. I think VLS is pretty good. I don't know of any ideas or concepts out there that really challenge, hey, missiles are going to go up and down anyways. Why not store them and shoot them up and down?
Right.
It's some go sideways, but for the most part, the first part of shooting a missile is getting to go up and down really fast. Might as well start it out that way.
Yeah. So, talking about the maintenance intensive, as we talked about before, the size 30, 50 feet long is pretty significant. That means it's on a large ship, right? So we're at a minimum on a cruiser destroyer sized ship. And if it's on something different than that, it's going to either take up most of the ship, or if you're talking about, this is all theoretical, but like the Russians have VLS systems on their aircraft carriers, but then that limits your space for everything that has to go with aircraft in terms of weapons, in terms of fuel, or aircraft themselves. So it's definitely a space consideration thing. Ships are big, but we still somehow fill them with all kinds of different technology. So kind of to draw some comparisons to some of the other options that are out there. So we talked about VLS being good. What else do we have as our missile delivery systems?
Yeah, so getting away from some of the sea-based, although I would like to mention the Zumwalt does have it's technically still VLS, but it's cool. It's on the peripherals of the side of the ship. So as you're walking down one of the P-ways, in the bulkhead are missile cells.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So it is, because it's still a similar VLS system, but instead of it just being in a block or a rectangle of cells, it lines the peripheral of the ship, which I think is a very cool design, because it allows you to have a very sleek body of the ship.
Just going beyond VLS, what are some other options that we have on our ships as missile delivery systems? Right,
yeah. So, the Harpoon missile as well. The large diagonally mounted canisters you see on the earlier Arleigh Burkes. They took them off for the later ones, unfortunately. But again, a very large anti-ship missile. It's been around for a while. It's a mature technology. But yeah, it's a pretty simple delivery system. You have 4 oppositely oriented tubes just mounted on the back of the aft VLS deck of the destroyers, and then the fantail on the cruisers with their secondary 5-inch gun. Again, just a pretty simple system. There's no real auxiliary support systems for that. It's an external canister, so it doesn't have a cooling system. It's just they're sort of just hanging out there on the flight deck. They obviously have their umbilicals to the control nodes. But yeah, that's another one.
So can we put the harpoons in VLS cells as well, or are they strictly canister launched?
So those are strictly canister. Well, and you can mount them on an aircraft as well.
Right.
I know some of the P3s, P8s. I know they can carry harpoons.
But we're not launching them out of VLS.
Correct. Yeah, the harpoon is not a VLS, and it is a large missile.
One of the things that you guys had on the LCS was the Naval Strike Missile, the
Oh,
NSM,
right.
which is kind of the Navy and Marine Corps' newest toy, I guess.
Right. Yeah, no, and there's definitely a good capability there, and I believe will eventually, or I guess that will be the bane of the harpoon, it's just a tremendously more capable missile.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm not hyper aware of the form factor of the Naval Strike Missile, but if you can put it on LCS, you can put it on any other ship in the fleet, except a minesweeper or PC. So I will, or patrol craft. So I will make that caveat, just so someone sitting somewhere doesn't call me out on that.
Right. So kind of looking at least those two, sea-based missile systems, I think one of the shared disadvantages that they have is from my understanding at least, the inability to replenish them at sea. So you go out and shoot, however many Tomahawks, SM2s or SM3s or harpoons out of canisters on the back. Once those are shot out, you're done until you can get back into port. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a very tough problem. They used to do it back in World War II, but that's because the only things they really shot in World War II were these big 16-inch shells, not basically exploding computers that travel at multiples the speed of sound. So yeah, it's a really tough problem. I mean, just anyone, an unrep, when you're just taking on gas and mail, is a difficult problem because you have two large dynamic objects in the ocean, very close to each other, 120 feet around separation between these two several thousand-ton displacement craft just bobbing around, and then you want to elevate an explosive between the two. So so even just that from an ORM standpoint, I mean, that would make most people shiver. But then if you actually can get past that and actually look at the problem-solving aspect of it, it's still very, very difficult. There no combatant ship in the U.S. Navy has a real robust crane system that could handle a missile onload. I mean, when we do missile onloads, it's a day-plus long evolution to take on a full loadout. And the crane they bring in is a giant commercial crane with the four legs that extend and press into the earth to level it, and it's a very large crane. And if you were to put that on a ship, again, that's another. I mean, our ships, like you said earlier, our ships are already packed full of systems and systems of systems. And to add another thing, a giant crane. I mean, we have a boat davit, but that can lift a rib with a couple people in it.
So yeah, like a small, like what you see like the Navy SEALs flying around.
Rigid hull inflatable boat. But yeah, it's orders of magnitude different, both from a weight standpoint, but then again also from a danger. I mean, because what if you drop a missile? I mean, God forbid it. I mean, there's numerous safeties built in, so usually if you just drop a missile, it's not like the movies.
Right.
There's tons of safeties involved. However, you just broke a missile.
Right.
And that missile was expensive, and that's one missile you don't have now to engage a potential incoming threat.
Yeah. So I think that kind of looking forward in the 2030, 2040 range and peer competitor areas, I mean, we can see, pretty large area denial technologies, that if we're going to report, if that's a known weakness of our system, a known, I don't know, vulnerability or weakness, I don't know what the best way to say that is, but, ports are fixed targets. Ballistic missiles they've been around since World War II, and all of our adversaries have ballistic missiles that are capable of ranging pretty much the entire United States, or at least able to range some of our significant port facilities, right? So the inability to replenish your firepower underway does start to become an issue when we're looking at actually expending ordnance there, right? So I think that's going to be really something that I don't know if we'll come up with the answer today, or maybe we'll try and bring in some people that are smarter than us about some ways that we can incorporate or, look at being able to rearm these ships underway. Because a ship without any missiles, so now you just have a really expensive sensor with a lot of people on it. So I think that is going to be a good discussion for us going forward, is trying to figure out ways to replenish offensive capabilities underway, or at least in an expeditionary manner.
Yeah, and that's a very I like how you mentioned that, just a very expensive sensor, because that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, just because you are out of ammo doesn't mean you still can't engage a target with someone else's magazine.
Right.
Given an integrated C2 structure, you can certainly, hey, I can see this guy, he's coming at me, I don't have anything to engage him. Here's his business card, give him a call. And your friend from down the way, who might have a couple extra Standard missiles hanging out, he can send a couple over the horizon and do you a favor.
Mm-hmm.
That is the way we are going. One of the things with this inability to replenish missiles at sea, and I mean, if we're worrying about, China and Russia hasn't come up with a good solution for that problem either, which is surprising because they're much more risk adverse than we are. I figured they would have come up with something by now.
Much less risk adverse.
Sorry, much less. Yes, way with words, right? They will do crazier things than we do.
Right.
I'll just put it that way. So I think a way to mitigate the issue of potentially running out of ammo is just to make each shot count more. Mm-hmm. So how do you do that? Get better target data. Have better missiles in each cell. And I think with a lot of the stuff that's coming online, Spy 6 is going to offer a tremendous leap in capability from the Spy 1. A lot of the SM6 capabilities are still maturing as technologies, but there's a lot of hope on the horizon for that, I think, just as an all-around amazing missile. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, if you know you cannot reload, make each shot count.
So I think that kind of through that discussion remind me of some other things that I've been reading about, talking about. I don't know what the correct way, the term that's generally used, but essentially a ship that's just a missile battery. So the kind of off-the-wall ideas that I've seen floated online are, let's take a container ship and throw a bunch of VLS, like hundreds of VLS systems on it. And now that floats in the middle of wherever, well outside of where the enemy is, especially if we're talking about Tomahawks or things with particularly long ranges. So now you have this boat with 200 plus VLS cells that you can use with those sensor data. So that could be something that we decide we do want to invest in or need as we continue this conversation. I think it's at least an interesting idea of having just this underway reserve of missiles.
Yeah, no, that's a very good and because I've seen that as well. And my comment always to the folks who want to just have these giant floating missile batteries. That's what submarines sort of are, but then they do a lot better job at hiding. You can stick over 100 Tomahawk cruise missiles on a SSGN. That's a tremendous capability right there.
Yeah. To me, the biggest disadvantage with the sub-based piece of it is as soon as you launch one of those missiles, you know where the sub is, which defeats a lot of the purpose of.
You're right. You're very right there. And then getting that target quality information to a submarine is also difficult, because how do you do that? You really can't when they're submerged. I'm not a submariner, but I would go as far to say as you cannot really get target quality data.
Yeah, and I think some of those discussions about that kind of exceed what we can talk about on the podcast.
Right.
It's a different animal than sending radio waves, that's for sure.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. For more information about today's guest and topics, please visit the show notes. The Trident Room podcast has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost at nps.edu and find us online at nps.edu/Trident Room Podcast.